Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're getting into it today, trying to navigate these sometimes tricky cultural differences you run into in this globalized world. You know those times, right, when things just don't quite connect with someone from another culture?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And those moments, sometimes they're just a bit awkward, but other times they can really mess things up, especially if you're trying to work together across borders.
Exactly, which is why we're diving straight into Erin Meyer's The Culture Map. Think of this as, well, a guide to understanding why people from different places communicate, give feedback, lead, well, do everything so differently.
Yeah, and our plan isn't just to summarize. We really want to unpack the thinking behind each chapter, give you a clear picture of her framework so you can actually, use these ideas.
We're kind of your cultural interpreters for today. We'll walk you through the main ideas in each chapter, pull out those key moments, those insights that can really change how you approach these cross-cultural situations. Okay, ready. Let's start with Chapter 1, Navigating Cultural Differences and the Wisdom of Mrs. Chen.
Right, this first chapter really sets the stage by showing how easily we misread things through our own cultural lens. Meyer starts with some really relatable stories from her early career.
She does. We meet Silent Bo, Mr. Chen, and Def Dulac, Mrs. Dulac, not their real names, of course. These were people Aaron worked with, and their behavior just didn't make sense to her initially. About Chen, Meyer wrote, articulate, extroverted, and very knowledgeable. Chen seemed perfect for the job.
Seems ideal, right? But then this guy who seems so capable just offered zero input in meetings. Nothing. Imagine that. And at the same time, you have Mrs. Dulac, a French manager, who seemed to totally misunderstand the feedback her American boss was giving her.
It's that classic mismatch of expectations, isn't it? Chen wasn't incompetent because he was quiet, and Dulac wasn't deliberately ignoring her boss's points.
Yeah.
And this is where Meyer really starts building her core argument. She puts it very clearly. The truth is that the story of Silent Bo is a story of culture, not personality.
And that's the crucial bit right there. Instead of just saying someone's shy or maybe not understanding, Meyer pushes us to look at the dupper cultural programming at play. These early puzzles really led her to explore this fundamental difference between high context and low context communication.
Right, so low context communication, think place like the US, maybe Germany, the Netherlands, it's all about being really explicit, really direct. The speaker basically has the job of making sure the message is absolutely clear.
Whereas high context communication, which you find in many Asian, Latin American, African cultures, relies much more on, well, what's not explicitly said. It's about shared understanding, unspoken cues, reading between the lines.
And this is where Meyer shares that fantastic advice she got from Mrs. Chen. Not some big shot executive, but her insights were spot on. Mrs. Chen told her, watch more, listen more, and speak less. Listen before you speak and learn before you act.
Sounds simple, but it's actually incredibly powerful, especially when you're outside your own cultural comfort zone. It's basically observe first, listen actively, then engage. Don't just jump in with your own style.
To make this high context idea really concrete,
Yeah.
Meyer tells that story about trying to find the Swagat restaurant in New Delhi. Remember that one?
Oh, yeah. The concierge gives directions, sounds helpful, but they're so indirect, so roundabout, that she ends up totally lost.
Exactly. The directions lacked that clear, step-by-step A to B to C structure someone from a low-context culture would probably expect. And this shows that difference in, like, communication philosophy. Meyer notes that in the U.S., it's often like, if you don't understand, it's my fault. The speaker takes responsibility.
But in many high context cultures, there's more expectation on the listener to pick up the implicit meaning. So if you're working with someone high context and feel lost, it might not just be on them to spell it all out. You need to listen differently, maybe ask clarifying questions more subtly.
And it's not just words. She then talks about that Owens Corning conference in Paris. The American CEO, David Brown, used a very low-context style repeating points, using bullet lists, really hammering things home.
Which works fine in a low context setting, but might feel a bit much, maybe even condescending, in a high context culture where subtlety is valued. This links to that Japanese idea of KY, kuki yomanai.
Right, one who cannot read the air. Someone who just misses all those unspoken cues, the implicit messages. It's a good reminder that communication is so much more than just the literal words.
Meyer then talks about something called second-degree communication, using that example of La Fontaine and King Louis XIV. What was that again?
Right, so La Fontaine wrote these seemingly innocent animal fables, but underneath, they were actually critiques of the king's spending. The surface story was one thing, but the real message, the political commentary, was understood by those in the know.
And Meyer points out this kind of layered communication is pretty common in French business, too. What's also fascinating is how much styles vary even within the same language group, like the US versus the UK or Brazil versus Peru. Culture runs way deeper than just language.
It really does. And it makes you think about history, right? How a country's past shapes communication.
Totally. Meyer explains how high context cultures often have these long shared histories. Think Japan's centuries of shared context create this rich implicit understanding. But then you look at the US, a younger nation built by immigrants.
You needed a more explicit way to communicate, right?
It,
To make sure everyone from different backgrounds could understand, low context becomes almost necessary.
exactly. It's about that baseline of shared knowledge. Alistair Murray's point about common sense being culturally specific really nails this. His example of meeting recap standard in the UK, but maybe seen differently elsewhere.
Yeah, in Spain, France, Italy, maybe that level of repetition seems like you're saying they didn't get it the first time. And Elizabeth Shen's insights on China are key, too. She says, when Chinese vaguely express an idea or an opinion, the real message is often just implied,
And she mentions pankyo seji, beating around the bush. It's not being evasive necessarily, it's about hinting, letting the listener connect the dots.
which you can imagine is tough for a low-context manager. They might feel they're not getting straight answers, while the high-context employee might feel micromanaged by overly direct instructions. Meyer really stresses clarifying things.
In that story about Bathari in Indonesia, her German boss wants written meeting recaps. Standard practice for him.
But for her Indonesian team, it felt like a lack of trust. A very high-context interpretation of a low-context request. Huge clash.
It's a perfect example of how something simple carries different cultural weight. The chapter finishes with that nice story about the proactive help Erin got in New Delhi when she was lost again.
Oh, right. The maps, the phone numbers, the offer of an escort. That kind of anticipates your needs helpfulness you often see in high-context settings. Okay, let's shift gears. Chapter 2. The many faces of polite evaluating performance and giving negative feedback across cultures. This is where things can get really awkward.
Typically. Because what's constructive criticism in one place can feel like a personal attack somewhere else. Meyer starts that story about Martin giving feedback to Willem in the Netherlands.
Right. Martin just lays out Willem's weaknesses quite bluntly in front of everyone, and Willem's reaction, he calls it a gift.
That's Dutch directness for you. The Netherlands is way over on the direct end of Meyer's evaluating scale. Honesty, transparency, even with negative stuff, is valued. But Meyer quickly contrasts this. Imagine that happening in, say, Thailand or Japan.
Oh, it would likely be seen as incredibly rude, unprofessional, maybe even humiliating. It shows how our default feedback style is just baked into our culture. And Meyer's point is crucial. These painful feedback moments often happen because of differing cultural norms, not necessarily arrogance or dishonesty.
That shift in perspective is so important. Stop judging based on your own norms. So, Meyer introduces this evaluating scale, direct negative feedback on one end, indirect on the other. And she talks about upgraders and downgraders.
Upgraders like totally unacceptable, really strengthen criticism. Downgraders like maybe consider or a little bit soften it. Knowing which way a culture leans is vital.
Meyer maps this out with communication context. Quadrant A, direct feedback, low context. Think Netherlands, Germany, Israel, Russia. Here you generally take messages literally, like that Korean expat in the Netherlands said when they don't like something, they tell you bluntly to your face.
Quadrant B is direct feedback, high context. The book doesn't focus heavily here, but you could imagine cultures where feedback is direct, but maybe delivered with more attention to face-saving or relationship context.
Then Quadrant C, indirect feedback, low context. The US is a classic example. Meyer talks about the American feedback sandwich,
Ah, yes, the compliment, then the criticism, then another compliment.
which can be incredibly confusing for people from more direct cultures. They might just hear the bread and miss the meat entirely.
Totally. Carlson's experience with Golov, the Russian working in the U.S., illustrates this perfectly. Golov's Russian directness felt harsh to Americans, and Golov herself struggled with the indirectness, saying, "My British friends here complain that I voice my opinion so strongly while I feel like I never know how they really feel about the situation." It shows how your own default blinds you.
It really does. And finally, Quadrant D, indirect feedback, high context. France is an interesting example here. Positive feedback might be quite subtle, maybe even just implied. Negative feedback, while the message might be critical, can sometimes be delivered with a certain intellectual intensity or passion.
Dulac's quote about interpreting French feedback is key. When I say okay, you should hear very good. And when I say good, you should hear excellent. It's a whole system of subtle calibration.
So, how do you give indirect feedback effectively in these high context places? Meyer shares INE's advice.
Right. First, give it slowly, over time. Don't overwhelm them. Second, maybe use food and drink, a social setting, to blur the lines and soften the message.
And the third one, which Erin found tricky at first, say the good and leave out the bad. You praise what works, and the problem areas are hinted at by, well, simply not being mentioned, like with those sloppy documents, just praise the good parts.
It's super indirect, pointing out a problem without ever actually stating it. The chapter ends with a really important warning, though.
Yeah.
If you're from an indirect culture, don't just try to copy the directness of others unless you really get the nuances.
Yeah, you could easily come across as just plain rude or aggressive.
Definitely. Okay, chapter 3, leading across cultures, levels of hierarchy and power. This gets into how different cultures see leaders and authority.
Yeah, this explores that whole spectrum, from very hierarchical setups to much more egalitarian ones, and how our background shapes what we expect from the boss. Meyer starts with Cara Williams presenting to that German auto supplier.
Oh yeah, Carr's American, right? She focused on practical applications, which worked great with an Australian company. But the Germans kept asking about the underlying theory, the principles first. Carr found it frustrating.
And that's the core difference. Principles first, or deductive reasoning, versus applications first, or inductive. Can you break those down quickly?
Sure, principles first starts broad with a theory or concept and drills down to specifics. Like that classic, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Deductive logic.
Got it.
Applications first is the other way around. You start with specific data, observations, examples, and build up to a general conclusion or pattern. Inductive reasoning.
And Meyer notes how education systems often reinforce this. Anglo-Saxon systems often emphasize learning by doing, practical application. Latin Germanic systems might focus more on mastering the theory first. Yasser Tawfik's experience studying in the UK versus the US really shows this.
It even shows up in legal systems, right? Common law is more applications first, building on precedents. Civil law is more principles first, based on broad statutes.
Exactly. And Stefan Baron, the French executive, found his carefully crafted principles-first arguments didn't land well with his British colleagues. They wanted the bottom line first. So Meyer gives advice.
Right. For applications first audiences, start with the summary, the recommendation. For principles first, lay out the methodology, the reasoning, then the conclusion. And for mixed groups.
Cycle between both. Explain the theory, give an example, back to theory, another example. Keep everyone engaged.
The chapter then shifts a bit, introducing holistic versus specific thinking, often seen as an east-west difference.
Yeah, holistic thinking, common in many Asian cultures, is about seeing the bigger picture, how everything connects. Specific thinking, more common in the West, tends to focus on individual components, analyzing things separately. Lily Lai's story in Hungary about trust and hierarchy kind of shows this holistic linking of issues.
Even Mr. Deng's comment about Chinese teams' employees might disagree with peers, but Never the Boss reflects that interconnectedness of hierarchy and communication. Meyer uses that fish photograph study too.
Oh yeah, the one where people look at a picture of fish. Americans tend to focus on the big central fish. Japanese participants often describe the whole scene, the background, the smaller fish, the relationships between everything. Like that Japanese woman said, I naturally look at all the items behind and around the large fish.
To determine what kind of fish they are, it's about context and relationships. And this affects management. Maleki tried using individual objectives with his Japanese team.
And it didn't quite work because they needed that holistic view first, to see how their part fit into the whole company strategy.
Then the chapter gets right into hierarchy itself, with Carlos Gomez and his Dutch team. His inner monologue, "Dear colleagues, in case you have forgotten, I am the boss."
Yeah.
It's funny, but it perfectly captures that culture clash.
He's coming from a more hierarchical background, encountering Dutch egalitarianism. This leads Meyer to bring in Geert Hofstede's concept of power distance, which he defined as,
The extent to which the less powerful members of organizations accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. It's fundamental to understanding these differences.
and Meyer puts this on her leading scale, looking at things like how much deference is shown to the boss. Is the boss seen as almost godlike in some places? Is it okay to skip levels? Does the leader need an aura of authority? Gutierrez's shock at the open door policy in the U.S.
Compared to France, yeah. Using the president's computer, unthinkable in a more hierarchical setting.
And the little things matter, like Meyer giving up her bike in China because it wasn't seen as appropriate for the boss locally. Those signals count. And it's not monolithic. Europe has huge variety, from egalitarian Scandinavia to more hierarchical Southern Europe.
Meyer touches on the historical roots: Roman Empire, Vikings, Confucianism. Those 5 Confucian relationships, the Wulun, really emphasize hierarchy with that implied 6th one, boss subordinate.
She gives practical tips, too. Watch the titles, the meeting etiquette, who pays at dinner in hierarchical cultures, and explains level hopping by passing your manager. Okay, in egalitarian places, maybe not so much elsewhere. Like Carlos Gomez and his Dutch assistant, Carl de Groot, just emailing the big boss directly.
So the advice is hierarchical cultures, respect the chain. Egalitarian, maybe go direct to the source if needed. And she suggests strategies for managing teams with different expectations, like maybe the boss shouldn't be in brainstorming sessions in hierarchical places, or using management by objectives in egalitarian ones.
It ends with a nuanced point, too. Germans seeing U.S. companies as hierarchical because of top-down decisions, even though German structures are formally hierarchical. Perception matters.
Okay, Chapter 4. Deciding how we make choices across cultures. Consensual or top-down. This gets into how decisions actually get made.
Right, and this deciding scale, Meyer points out, often correlates with the leading scale we just discussed. She starts with that German-American merger negotiation example.
Yes, the big clash. The Germans expected consensus, even on meeting agendas. Martina Muller said, even the agendas of the weekly management meetings are built by consensus. And the American CEO was much more top-down. Created a lot of friction.
Meyer then makes a useful distinction. Consensus with a capital C, where everyone really agrees before moving forward. Slower decision, but strong buy-in. Versus consensus with a lowercase c, where the leader consults but ultimately decides. Faster, maybe, but might need more selling later.
The Swedish approach described by Per Ingman sounds very capital C, contrasted with the American desire for speed, even with less consultation. Per felt Americans were always trying to impose a decision for decision's sake without soliciting the necessary feedback. Pretty direct quote there.
And then there's Sheldon's experience in Japan. He's in a meeting expecting a discussion about a product decision, and nothing happens. The decision just seems to emerge later.
Because of Nimawashi, that behind-the-scenes consensus building. Susumi Mori explained it. Nimawashi. We spend a lot of time talking with everyone individually beforehand. By the time the meeting occurs, everyone is already in agreement.
So what looks like no discussion is actually the result of expensive pre-discussion. Meyer's point is, neither style is inherently better, but problems arise when expectations don't match.
Her advice: in consensual cultures, be patient. In top-down ones, be ready to execute decisions even if you weren't in the room. For leaders, maybe find a balanced consult, but then decide efficiently.
And crucially, she recommends explicitly discussing how decisions will be made right at the start of a cross-cultural project. Agree on the process up front.
Yeah, that seems like it could save a lot of trouble. The chapter wraps up showing how this approach helped those German-American merger talks get back on track by building awareness of their different styles.
Makes sense.
All right, Chapter 5. Trusting how relationships affect our ability to work together. This is a big one, trust.
Huge. This chapter introduces the trusting scale, task-based versus relationship-based. And Meyer breaks trust down into 2 types. Cognitive trust based on reliability, skill, accomplishments. Head-based trust.
And effective trust based on feelings of emotional closeness, connection, warmth. Heart-based trust.
Morel's story trying to negotiate in China really kicks this off. He found his counterparts impenetrable at first. Then a consultant told him to forget the deal for a bit and focus on building guangxi.
That personal connection, the consultant's advice was pretty explicit. Build trust as a friend from the heart. Go out, enjoy some meals, build an emotional connection, open up personally, make a friend. That's pure effective trust building.
And Meyer explains how these 2 types of trust mix differently. In task-based cultures, like the U.S., they can be quite separate. You trust someone's work, cognitive, without needing a deep personal bond, effective.
But in relationship-based cultures, China, Brazil, India, many others, they're much more intertwined. Effective trust often paves the way for cognitive trust.
Jing Ren's story about his American colleague acting like a stranger during a negotiation, despite their existing relationship, really shows that task-based separation. Ren said, he was treating me as if we had no relationship at all. It captures that business is business versus business is personal divide.
The trusting scale places the U.S. way over on the task-based side, with the BRIC countries more towards relationship-based. Makes you think about those typical American networking events or team lunches.
Meyer suggests they're often more about establishing cognitive trust, assessing competence, reliability. As she says, friendliness does not equal friendship in these settings.
She uses that great peach versus coconut analogy, too. Peaches, like U.S. Brazil, are soft and friendly on the outside quickly, but have a hard pit of privacy. Coconuts, like Russia, Germany, are harder to crack initially, but the relationships, once formed, are often deeper and longer lasting. Igor Agapova's airplane story.
Yeah, the American asks lots of personal questions. Igor thinks they're now friends, but then gets a superficial goodbye. Different signals. Schwartz's success in Russia came from taking the time to connect personally, first talking grandkids, shared interests before talking business, investing in that effective trust.
So the advice for relationship-based cultures is invest time, find personal links, be patient.
Yeah.
Gyani using Indian pop music to connect with his team, it seems small, but it builds that bridge.
Meyer also flags the challenge of building trust virtually without those face-to-face moments. You have to make an extra effort. And she makes that powerful statement. In many relationship-based cultures, the relationship is your contract. Ricardo Bartolome's observation about Americans being careful not to show business counterparts who they really are fits here.
Crooner's getting exhausted from all the socializing with Latin American colleagues. It shows the sheer time and energy investment required. Meyer says, basically, join in. Don't skip the dinners and drinks.
Meals are huge for trust building. Guillermo Nunez's story about the task-based colleague at lunch really drives that home. And Meyer gives tips on phone calls and emails mirror the other person's level of social chat. Jaroslav Bukowski learning to adapt his email style for Indian colleagues is a good example. Basically, socializing first often feels more natural in relationship-based settings.
Okay, chapter 6. The needle, not the knife. Disagreeing productively across cultures. How different cultures handle conflict and disagreement.
This introduces the disagreeing scale, confrontational versus avoids confrontation. It's about whether open disagreement is seen as positive or negative for relationships. Meyer starts with that French dinner party scene.
Right, Helene and Juliet having a really passionate argument about golf. To outsiders, it might seem intense, but for them, it's just normal debate, maybe even enjoyable. Contrast that with Elizabeth Shen feeling personally attacked when her French colleagues challenged her ideas.
Exactly. It shows how subjective disagreement feels. Meyer then brings in the Japanese concept of wa harmony and how deeply impolite open disagreement is there. The saying, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down, really sums it up.
Meyer then maps this onto another four-quadrant model, combining disagreement style with emotional expressiveness. Quadrant A, confrontational and emotionally expressive. France, Italy, Spain fit here. Debate is normal, emotions might show.
Quadrant B, confrontational but emotionally unexpressive. Germany, Netherlands, Denmark. Debate is valued, often seen as crucial for finding truth, that idea of Sachlichkeit, but you keep emotions controlled. Dirk's quote is key. When I say I totally disagree, I'm debating Erin's position, not disapproving of her.
Quadrant C avoids confrontation but emotionally expressive. Think Mexico, Brazil, Argentina. Disagreement is often indirect because openly confronting someone could damage the relationship, even if emotions run high sometimes.
And Quadrant D avoids confrontation and emotionally unexpressive. Many Asian cultures fall here. Harmony is the priority, disagreement is subtle, maybe nonverbal, or avoided if possible. Meyer stresses the scale is about whether disagreement harms relationships, not just about volume or emotion.
So how do you disagree well across these divides?
Mm-hmm.
Meyer suggests in avoid confrontation cultures, building strong trust first is essential before you can expect more openness.
And she gives strategies for multicultural teams. Maybe the boss shouldn't always be present to reduce hierarchy's impact. Prepare agendas and questions clearly in advance, especially for avoid confrontation cultures like Japan. That was Yoshisaki's advice to Madsen. Maybe have meetings before the meeting. And adjust your language, use more downgraders, and avoid confrontation settings.
Wei Lin's story, the Chinese professor in Europe, is great. She initially felt attacked by direct questioning, but learned to allow the debate without feeling the need to push back confrontationally herself, finding a middle ground.
The chapter ends with a warning. Trying to be more confrontational than your natural style is risky. Be mindful of what feels aggressive. Meyer notes this is especially important for, say, French people working with Americans or Brits, who often prioritize harmony more than the French might expect.
Right. Okay. Chapter 7. How late is late? Scheduling and cross-cultural perceptions of time. This is about how we view and manage time.
This chapter contrasts linear time cultures one thing at a time. Schedules are sacred with flexible time cultures. Multitasking is fine. Schedules are guidelines. Meyer starts with her own experience in Paris.
Her 10 a.m. meeting starting, well, not at 10 a.m., highlighting that more fluid approach common in Latin cultures. A big contrast to that conference in Denver with Danielle's super strict minute-by-minute time cards.
And Flavio Renato in Brazil, totally relaxed about presentation length. Please feel free to take more time. The group will benefit. That would send shivers down the spine of a linear time manager. Meyer lays out the scheduling scale.
Germanic, Anglo-Saxon, Northern European tend towards linear. Latin, Middle Eastern, African cultures, often more flexible. Asian cultures are mixed. Japan, very linear. China and India, more flexible.
She uses that great queuing analogy, the orderly line in Stockholm versus the more dynamic swarm in indoor. And the Indian host's explanation makes so much sense. We are more flexible in India because we grew up in a society where governments could change regulations on a whim. We learned to value flexibility.
It shapes how meetings run, too. Linear time, strict agenda, sequential topics, flexible time, more fluid, interruptions are normal, the conversation might wander, Mucka arriving late for dinner at his American boss's house.
And the hosts are worried. Did you get lost? For them, lateness signals a problem. For Moda, it might have been perfectly normal. Maya talks about style switching, adapting your approach, but admits it takes practice. Cam Johnson's experience going from super punctual Japan, with fines, to more flexible Beijing shows this need to adapt.
She really stresses setting clear expectations about time and scheduling within an international team. Explicitly agree on the team's time culture. That Dutch participants' confusion about strict U.S. time management just shows how ingrained our own norms feel.
Yeah, the chapter ends on that note. Our own cultural relationship with time feels like the way until you bump up against a totally different one. Like that Swedish anecdote about babies napping outside seems unrelated, but it shows how deeply embedded cultural norms are.
Finally, the short epilogue. Putting the culture map to work. It's about applying all this.
Right. Key advice. Actually map out your team on the scales. Visualize the differences. Increase awareness within the team about how culture is playing out. Encourage flexibility.
It also mentions having cultural bridges on the team, people who can help translate between styles. And crucially, keep suspending judgment. Try to see things from the other cultural perspective.
Yeah, the takeaway is that understanding these differences isn't just interesting, it's a core skill for actually working effectively together globally.
So wrapping up our deep dive into Erin Meyer's The Culture Map, we've really walked through those 8 scales: communicating, evaluating, leading, deciding, trusting, disagreeing, and scheduling. How culture shapes all of it.
And getting a handle on these nuances, it's not just about avoiding awkward moments. It's really fundamental to building effective, less stressful, more productive international relationships and teams.
Definitely. So a final thought for you. Think about your own work environment, the teams you're on. Where do you see these cultural patterns playing out? How might understanding Meyer's map help you navigate things better? We definitely recommend checking out her book for more detail. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.